The young teller smirked as he denied the elderly farmer's final payment, loud enough for the whole bank to hear. But then the glass doors opened, and a man in a tailored suit strode in, locking eyes on the humiliated veteran. "Is there a Mr. Boone here?" he asked. What happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly above, nearly drowned out by the soft shuffle of papers and the rhythmic click of polished shoes on tile. Harold Boone stood out, not by appearance but by the sheer stillness of him. In a room of motion and murmurs, he remained unmoving, a stubborn echo of a different time. His back was slightly hunched from years behind a plow, but his posture still held the pride of a man who once worked 1,000 acres by sunrise. He didn't look frail, just slowed, like an old engine that had never once failed to start, but now took a little coaxing. The denim shirt he wore was freshly pressed. His veteran's cap was faded, the stitching loose near the brim, but the emblem was clean, reverent. The envelope in his hands was thick not with cash, but with effort. Each bill tucked inside had been earned in mud, under sun, and through nights when the barn roof nearly caved in. He had counted it twice that morning, then once more on the front seat of his old pickup, just to be sure. Every penny mattered. But to the teller behind the counter, mid-20s, face too smooth for that much smugness, Harold Boone was nothing more than an inconvenience. The man's voice carried a sheen of practiced politeness, layered thin over open ridicule. His eyes flicked to Harold like he was glancing at a smudge on glass. Behind Harold, the line began to grow. A woman in business slacks tapped her heel. A college kid sighed loudly. Someone muttered something about people who still use cash. He didn't shift, didn't react, not even when the whispering started. The young teller leaned to a coworker and tilted his head slightly toward the lobby. They both chuckled. Short, sharp exhalations meant to hurt without taking responsibility. One of them mouthed the word museum. Harold looked down at the floor, not in shame, but to study the marble swirl of the tile. He traced the vein in it with his eyes, slow and patient. Somewhere in his chest, his heart beat as steady as it had on the day he watched his wife lower her last calf alone while he was still in the hospital. This wasn't the hardest moment he'd lived through, not even close. But it was the quietest cruelty he'd felt in a while, and still, he waited. Not for charity, not for sympathy, just for the dignity of being treated like his time mattered. What he didn't know was that someone in the corner, someone with a sharper eye and a longer memory, was already picking up their phone, watching, listening, and about to change everything. Harold Boone stepped forward like a man carrying more than his years, his feet slow, the ache in his knees sharp with every inch toward that glass partition. He didn't flinch when the teller tapped impatient fingers on the counter, nor when he exhaled through his nose with the kind of theatrical annoyance reserved for people too self-important to recognize dignity in others. The envelope shook slightly in Harold's hands, not from fear, but fatigue. "For the tax office," he said, placing it on the counter with quiet precision. The teller pinched it between two fingers like it might stain his manicure. He peeled it open and thumbed through the bills with exaggerated slowness. Then he tossed it back toward Harold. "You're short by $57, he said, not bothering to mask the satisfaction in his voice. Harold didn't blink. "I called ahead. They said," the teller cut in. "Doesn't matter what they said. I know policy. You're short." He leaned back in his chair like a judge pronouncing sentence. Harold simply nodded once, not because he agreed, but because there wasn't anything left to say. Then the glass doors burst inward with the soft whoosh of hydraulics and a sudden gust of spring wind. All heads turned. The man who entered was tall, mid-40s, with silvering temples and a suit that cost more than Harold's yearly fuel bill. He didn't walk, he moved, with purpose, with precision, with the kind of quiet authority that made people instinctively sit up straighter and rethink their tone. The teller sat back up. Too late. The branch manager rushed from the side office, tugging at his tie. "Mr. Corbin, we weren't expecting you until—" The man didn't break stride. "Is there a Mr. Boone here?" he asked, scanning the room like he already knew the answer. Harold blinked, then raised his hand slightly, unsure. "That's me." The man approached, extended a hand, and smiled, not a corporate smile, but a warm, grounded one. "Jonathan Corbin, Vice President. My grandfather fought in the 25th with yours. I saw your name this morning flagged in an internal report. Land at risk, payment flagged, prior military. I came myself." The room fell into a breathless hush. The teller? He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Harold with eyes wide and skin gone white, the flush of mockery now bleeding into regret. Harold's hand, calloused, warm, real, met Corbin's in a firm shake. For the first time that morning, he felt the weight of the room shift. Not because he'd raised his voice, but because someone who mattered had remembered his name. And that, more than anything, spoke louder than policy. Jonathan Corbin moved with the steadiness of someone who had weighed his actions long before stepping foot in that branch. He gestured with a nod toward the corner office. "May we speak in private, Mr. Boone?" Harold glanced over his shoulder as if checking for someone to confirm this was real. Then he gave a tired nod. His cane tapped the floor softly as he followed. Inside, the room was modest, an outdated credenza, faded family photo on the sill, and a coffee maker blinking from disuse. Corbin closed the door gently behind them. The click seemed to mute the rest of the bank. In the silence, something shifted. It wasn't just sound that left the room. It was pretense. Corbin's posture changed, shedding the crisp formality of title and becoming something else, something more human. "My grandfather, Robert Corbin," he said, pulling out the leather chair across from Harold. "He talked about your family's farm like it was part of his own bloodline. Said when his tractor died in the middle of winter, it was your father who brought him fuel. When his roof collapsed, it was your hands that fixed it before the snow could settle." Harold didn't know what to say. The mention of his father, his land, words that hadn't touched the air in any reverent way in years, made something twist in his chest. Not grief, exactly. Not nostalgia. Something heavier. Something like being remembered after everyone else has forgotten. Corbin pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk with deliberate care. "This," he said, "covers the tax payment in full. It also clears the lien on your southern lot. And—" He opened the folder so Harold could see. "Forgiveness on the bank note from 2014. Harold leaned forward slowly, his hands hovering above the paper like they might crumble it just by touch. The numbers stared back at him, familiar weights. He'd carried them so long they had become part of his posture. And now, here they were, scratched out, lifted. "I can't accept this," he said hoarsely. Corbin met his eyes. "You already did. When you spent 70 years showing this town what honor looks like. This isn't charity, Mr. Boone. This is long overdue respect." Through the glass, Harold could see the teller at his desk. Gone was the smirk, the shrug. Now he sat rigid, face pale, glancing up with growing unease as if waiting for a verdict only time could deliver. But in this office, the verdict had already come, and it was spelled in ink, not judgment. When Harold Boone stepped out of the office beside Jonathan Corbin, it was as if the very air inside the bank had shifted. The hum of printers, the click of keyboards, the murmured conversations, all paused. Heads turned, eyes followed. For once, the old man with the worn cane wasn't invisible. He walked slowly, but with purpose. The ache in his knees remained, but something deeper, something heavier, had been lifted. Corbin didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Standing tall at the teller counter, he addressed the young man who only hours earlier had sneered with performative condescension. "One more thing," Corbin said calmly, the authority in his voice unmistakable. The teller stiffened, hands frozen on the edge of the desk. His eyes darted toward the branch manager hovering in the background, but no help came. "If a veteran," Corbin said, his gaze never wavering, "or anyone who's spent a lifetime giving more than they ever received, walks through those doors." He paused, just long enough to let the silence settle. "You'll show them the dignity they earned. Not because it's policy, because it's decent, if that proves too difficult. This won't be your counter much longer." A breath caught somewhere in the room. Someone near the lobby cleared their throat, nervous or ashamed. It was hard to tell. The teller opened his mouth, then shut it. His face was drained of color. All the false confidence, the smirks, the careless superiority, gone. What remained was a young man forced to face the weight of his own smallness. Harold said nothing. He didn't need to. He offered a single nod, not of forgiveness, but of finality. Then he turned toward the door, cane tapping steadily on the polished tile. Corbin walked with him, step for step, past the stairs, past the forced smiles, past the stunned silence of those who now realized they had witnessed something important, and perhaps had been complicit in something worse. The sunlight outside hit differently, warmer, truer, as if the world had tilted back into alignment, even if just by a few degrees. Harold Boone didn't stride, he didn't float, but the weight on his shoulders, the one built from decades of being overlooked, was lighter now, not because the world had changed, because someone had reminded it to look again. And in that morning light, with Corbin's hand resting briefly on his shoulder, Harold no longer felt like the past. He felt like a man who still mattered.